Imagine standing in the middle of a dense Central American jungle, just looking up at the towering stone pyramids of Pikul. Or maybe wandering through the vast, kind of silent, sun-baked ruins of the Roman aqueducts out in the European countryside.
Oh, yeah. Those places always give me the chills.
Right. It's like when we look at these monuments, these massive husks of dead empires, there's this natural human tendency to view them through a lens of tragic mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
We ask ourselves, what happened? Was it a drought? Maybe a sudden invasion, a plague? We treat the death of a civilization like it's a medical mystery.
That's a really good way to put it, a medical mystery.
And usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's an expectation of precision. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line,
Yeah.
and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
Right. It's binary. The bone is broken or it isn't. The diagnosis is clean, and the mechanism of injury is usually completely obvious.
But what happens when you try to take an x-ray of an entire civilization? Like, what actually happens to a nation after its great triumphant story ends?
I mean, that is a deeply haunting question. And it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters,
Yeah.
Because societies don't usually leave a clean break on an X-ray. A civilization rarely dies on a Tuesday.
Right. No one just wakes up and the empire's gone.
Exactly. The collapse is often an agonizingly slow process, and it's almost always masked by layers of temporary political fixes and, well, social denial.
And that is exactly the terrain we are exploring in this deep dive today. Because the source material we are looking at does something incredibly unexpected with this exact question.
He really does.
We're going to examine an exegesis, which is a highly detailed structural textual analysis written by the scholar Ahmad Parwez. And he is focusing on the epilogue of a very famous story.
The narrative of Yusuf, or Joseph, as found in the Quran. And, the story of Yusuf is universally known. It crosses multiple religious and cultural boundaries. I mean, it's an epic in the truest sense of the word.
Oh, absolutely.
You have a boy betrayed, thrown into a dark well by his envious brothers, sold into slavery in a foreign land.
Unjustly imprisoned, too.
Right, unjustly imprisoned, who eventually relies on his intellect and his moral fortitude to rise and become the economic savior of all of Egypt during a devastating famine. It is like the ultimate triumphant narrative arc.
It's the classic hero's journey. The hero wins, the treacherous brothers apologize, they are forgiven, the family is reunited, fade to black, roll credits.
Yeah, everybody goes home happy.
But Parwez points out something fascinating here. The text doesn't actually stop there. The personal story ends. But the book leaves us with this chilling sociopolitical epilogue about the mechanics of civilizational death.
Yeah, and most people read that narrative and think the climax is the emotional reunion.
Naturally, yeah.
But Parwez argues that the epilogue is actually the core thesis of the entire narrative. The story of Yusuf is just the practical demonstration. It's the case study.
So the concluding passages provide the theoretical framework.
Exactly.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to look at this ancient text not as a collection of mythical stories or, personal moral comfort, but as the ultimate socio-political manual for human survival and prosperity.
Which is a huge claim.
It's massive. We are going to explore the mechanics of societal collapse, the absolute necessity of logic over blind faith, and the intensely controversial history of how texts are preserved.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
So much ground. And I have to say, I am immediately fascinated by the idea that an ancient religious text is being framed by this author as a book of social physics.
Social physics, yes.
The idea that it's a blueprint for how societies rise and fall based on immutable mathematical laws rather than just like mystical intervention.
It's a complete paradigm shift. Usually people approach a text like this looking for spiritual comfort, They want personal moral guidelines to make them feel peaceful. But Parwez is arguing that this text is giving us the hard, unbreakable laws of human sociology.
Like, it's diagnosing exactly why those Roman aqueducts run dry and why those Mayan pyramids are swallowed by the jungle.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this diagnosis, because the structural flaw Parwez identifies early in this epilogue is pretty radical. He fundamentally redefines a concept that most people think they already understand perfectly.
You're talking about the concept of shirk.
Yes, shirk.
Yeah.
Now, if you have even a passing familiarity with Islamic theology, or just theology in general, that word is usually translated as polytheism or idolatry, right? Like bowing down to statues.
Traditionally, yes, absolutely. It's understood as setting up partners with God in a literal, often physical sense, worshiping multiple deities.
Sure.
But Parwez looks at the text, and he points out that it explicitly states most people who claim to believe in God are actually practicing shirk without even knowing it.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They are polytheists while actively calling themselves pure monotheists.
Which, on its face, just sounds like a paradox. How can you be a monotheist and a polytheist at the exact same time?
Well, this is where Parwez introduces the concept of dualism. In modern political terms, we might call it a kind of secularism, but he uses it in a very specific structural way.
Okay, break that down for me.
He argues that the ultimate, most destructive form of shirk is compartmentalizing life.
So, like, keeping God in a box.
Precisely. It is the belief that divine laws are sovereign over your personal rituals.
Like how you pray.
Right. How you pray, how you fast, your internal spiritual life, what you do in the privacy of your home.
Okay, I'm following.
But when it comes to the macro structures of life, I'm talking the economy, politics, social welfare, the justice system, international relations, you adopt human-made, purely pragmatic laws.
Ah, so you split your allegiance.
You do. You have one moral authority for the mosque or the church, and a completely different, unrelated, and often contradictory authority for the parliament and the stock exchange.
Now, I just want to pause here for a second. If you're listening to this and wondering if we're taking a stance on secularism or theocracy, we really aren't.
No, not at all.
We are purely dissecting Parwez's mechanical argument here, because it's just a fascinating interpretation. He's saying that this division, this dualism, is what the text actually means by idolatry.
Right. It's not about wood and stone. It's about legislative and moral authority.
But I do have to push back a little here just to play devil's advocate. Isn't compartmentalization just practical? I mean, it's how human beings survive in the modern world.
Sure, yeah.
We can't be intensely, purely spiritually focused when we're trying to negotiate a corporate trade deal or balance a municipal budget, right?
Well, that is the exact defense of dualism, but Parwez argues that what you're calling practicality is actually a fatal cognitive dissonance.
Fatal.
Yeah. Think about the psychological comfort of that compartmentalization. We love to keep our moral and spiritual beliefs safe in a pristine little box. It makes us feel righteous. Meanwhile, out in the real world of business and politics, we play by ruthless, exploitive rules. We tell ourselves, well, business is business.
Right. It's just the way the world works.
But Parwez is arguing that claiming a divine moral standard of equity and justice, but then building a societal structure on contrary, exploitative human standards, it eventually tears the societal fabric apart.
Because the system is essentially at war with itself.
Exactly. The values don't align. The foundation is cracked.
And this brings us to the text's warning about how destruction actually arrives for a society that lives in this divided state. The author points out that the text describes collapse arriving in one of two ways.
Yes.
The first is Baghtatan, which means suddenly.
Right. A sudden, overwhelming collapse. Think of an overnight economic crash, a sudden violent revolution, or a catastrophic foreign invasion.
So to the people living inside the system, it looks like it came completely out of nowhere. But the second way it arrives is described almost like a creeping shadow, a slow poisoning. And this is the one that really gets me, because it is so insidious.
Oh, it's terrifying.
It reminds me of, imagine a massive steel suspension bridge. Over decades, the structural integrity of that bridge is slowly being eaten away by rust.
Okay.
Millions of cars drive over it year after year. The commuters don't notice the daily microscopic decay. The rust is completely silent.
They're just listening to the radio, drinking their coffee.
Exactly. But then, one random Tuesday, the bridge suddenly collapses under a completely normal load of morning traffic.
That is a brilliant analogy, because to the commuter driving on that Tuesday, the collapse is sudden. It's Baghtatan.
Right.
But to the structural engineer who comes in later to look at the wreckage, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the inevitable mathematical result of the accumulative effect of the rust.
Wow.
Parwez points out that a society doesn't just die overnight. It suffers from a slow deterioration of its values, its justice system, its equity.
Like the wealth gap widening imperceptibly year by year.
Exactly. Trust in institutions erodes millimeter by millimeter. This is the creeping death.
And the people living on the bridge are just completely oblivious. Which makes me wonder, if adopting this dualism is the disease, why do so many people fall into it? Like, why do we ignore the rust for decades?
Well, Parwez diagnoses this as a fundamental lack of critical thinking. It's what the text calls the blindness of the masses.
The blindness of the masses.
Yeah. The source describes people who literally walk past the structural evidence of the universe, the signs in the heavens and the earth, as it says, and they just keep walking.
They never stop to examine the mechanics of their reality.
No, they never ask why.
They just accept the world as a static backdrop. They don't see it as a mechanism with moving parts.
Exactly. And this is where Parwez extracts two foundational scientific principles from the text.
Okay.
And he argues these are actually divine laws that govern both the physical universe and human sociology. First, the law of cause and effect, and second, the law of uniformity of nature.
Okay, let's break those down, because I really have to point out the profound irony here.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
Right. Religious texts, especially ancient ones, are so often stereotyped as being inherently anti-science.
Absolutely.
They're usually framed as demanding a complete suspension of the scientific method in favor of magical thinking or miracles. Yet this specific exegesis is framing the Quran as aggressively demanding empirical observation.
It is a massive reversal of the common stereotype. Parwez argues that the universe runs on one unified law. This is his practical, physical application of Tawhid, which is the Islamic concept of the oneness of God.
Okay, so Tawhid isn't just about theology.
Right. For Parwez, Tawhid is not just a theological statement that there is only one God to worship. It is a scientific statement that there is only one set of universal laws governing all of reality.
So the law of uniformity of nature means that gravity works the exact same way in ancient Egypt as it does in modern-day New York.
Right. And the law of cause and effect means that every action has an equal, predictable consequence.
Good.
Parwez argues that this doesn't just apply to physics. It applies directly to sociology. Any effect in a society, say, extreme poverty, rampant crime, or civil unrest, has a direct structural cause.
It is not random bad luck.
Exactly. It is not the universe just having a bad day.
It's the rust on the bridge. The rust causes the structural failure.
Yes. And if we connect this to the broader theme of our deep dive, a lack of what the text calls fiqh, which means intellection or deep critical thought, destroys a society because it detaches people from the reality of cause and effect.
Think about the implications of that. If a society thinks that an economic collapse or a famine is just the gods being angry or just a stroke of bad luck,
Yeah.
rather than the mathematical result of their own corrupt banking practices or terrible agricultural policies, well, they can never fix the root problem.
No, they can't.
They'll just offer a sacrifice or pray for better luck next time while continuing the exact same destructive practices.
And because they haven't changed the underlying cause, they will inevitably continue to collapse. The text, according to Parwez, demands that people stop walking blindly past the evidence.
Right.
It demands they look at the societal systems, map out the causal links, and actively change the structure.
Okay, so if we accept that this text demands empirical observation, how does it define faith? Because this brings us to an incredible linguistic shift.
It really does.
The text uses the Arabic word Baseerah, and this fundamentally redefined what the word faith actually means in this context.
Yeah, so the verse states, say, "This is my path. I invite to Allah on the basis of Baseerah."
And Parwez goes to great lengths to contrast Baseerah with the traditional or Western concept of faith.
Right.
Usually if someone says, hey, you just got to have faith, what they mean is you need to believe in something without evidence. It's a leap into the dark. It's trusting your gut when the facts aren't there.
Right. Believing despite the lack of proof. It's almost worn as a badge of honor, like the less evidence you have, the stronger your faith must be. But Parwez defines Baseerah strictly as insight, empirical evidence, reason, and logic.
That's completely different.
It is. He asserts that the text insists its message must be adopted purely on logic and evidence, absolutely and violently rejecting the concept of blind faith.
So he argues that the divine doesn't want you to close your eyes and jump off a cliff. It wants you to open your eyes, examine the geological stability of the ground, and walk confidently on a well-lit path.
That's a great way to put it. It's a massive epistemological shift. Think about what this means. If the universe runs on observable, uniform laws, then a divine message aligning with those laws must also be observable and logically sound.
Okay.
You do not accept a system because you were born into it, or because a priest told you to, or because your ancestors do it. You accept it because you have investigated it, stress-tested it, and found it to be structurally sound.
And Parwez provides this incredible, deeply tragic historical anecdote to show just how dangerous this idea of Baseerah has been to establish powers throughout history.
Right, you decides.
Yes. He talks about the Mutazilites. Wait, walk me through the history here, because this is fascinating. Who were they exactly?
Okay, so the Mutazilites were a group of highly influential rationalist thinkers. They flourished in the Islamic world, primarily in Baghdad, during the 8th to 10th centuries.
So this is during the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yes, exactly. A time of massive intellectual expansion, often called the Islamic Golden Age. The Mutazilites were heavily engaged with the translation movement.
Right, translating Greek texts and stuff.
Right, absorbing Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotelian logic. And their core defining philosophy was that human reason is the ultimate touchstone for understanding religion and divine justice.
So they basically applied the scientific method to theology.
Precisely. They argued that God is bound by rational justice. Therefore, if a literal reading of a religious text contradicted human reason or clear logical justice, the text could not be taken literally.
It had to be reinterpreted allegorically.
Exactly. They believed that reason preceded revelation.
They were absolute champions of empirical reasoning. And what happened to them? Parwez notes that they were historically persecuted. Their blood literally flowed in the streets of Baghdad.
Yeah, it was brutal.
How do you go from being the intellectual vanguard of an empire to being slaughtered?
It is a textbook example of the clash between reason and entrenched power. Initially, the Mutazilites actually enjoyed state sponsorship under certain caliphs, most notably al-Mamun.
Okay.
He even instituted an inquisition known as the Mina to enforce their rationalist views.
Oh, wow. So they had the power of the state.
For a while, yes. But eventually the political winds shifted. A subsequent caliph, al-Mutawakkil, recognized that the Orthodox traditionalists had the backing of the populist masses.
Oh, politics.
Always politics. To secure his political power, he reversed state policy, outlawed Mutazilite thought, and basically unleashed the traditionalists upon them.
But why is institutional power always so terrified of empirical reasoning? Like, why did the Orthodox establishment need them erased so completely?
Because of the mechanics of power and reason. The paradox Parwez highlights is really stark. The text demands evidence-based conviction, yet historical, religious, and political institutions almost universally demand unquestioning submission.
Ah, I see. Because if you encourage people to use Baseerah to demand empirical evidence and logical consistency, they aren't just going to apply it to ancient texts or abstract theology.
No, they are not.
They are going to apply it to the people currently in charge.
Exactly. Baseerah inherently encourages questioning assumptions. If you teach a populace to demand proof of cause and effect, they will inevitably look at a corrupt ruler and say, well, we used our reason.
Right, like your policies are the mathematical cause of our poverty.
Exactly. Therefore, you are unjust and you must be removed. Rationality is an existential threat to entrenched power structures that rely on the blindness of the masses to maintain control.
That makes total sense.
When you tell people that the divine explicitly demands they use their brains, the autocrats lose their ultimate weapon, which is the demand for blind obedience disguised as piety.
Okay, so if we accept this premise and we actually apply this Baseerah, this empirical observation, to human history, what are we supposed to find? Where is the evidence?
Well, this brings us to the concept of social physics and the law of requital.
Yes, let's get into the social physics.
So the text commands the listener to travel the earth and observe the akiba of those who came before. Now, traditionally, that word akiba is heavily spiritualized.
How so?
It's often translated simply as the afterlife. It's pushed completely into the mystical post-death realm.
Right, like look at the dead people. They are facing their judgment in the afterlife now.
But Parwez translates akiba very differently based on its linguistic root. He argues it means the future or the ultimate consequence of nations right here on earth.
Right here, right now.
Yes. The command isn't just to sit in a room and meditate about heaven and hell. It's an active command to study sociology, archaeology, economics, and history.
He literally says that ruins are not tourist attractions. They are a database of societal failures.
That is the absolute essence of social physics. Just as a biochemist goes to a laboratory to see the results of an experiment under a microscope,
Yeah.
A thinker uses Baseerah to go to the ruins of a collapsed civilization to observe the macro results of systemic corruption and inequity.
And Parwez actually presented this idea in academia, and people did not like this interpretation at all.
Oh no, they hated it.
He mentions an anecdote from a 1964 seminar at Punjab University. He presented a paper to a room full of esteemed religious scholars and historians, arguing exactly this.
Right.
That the future or consequence mentioned in the Quran applies heavily to the rise and fall of nations in the present world, governed by strict earthly laws of cause and effect.
And the backlash he faced in that room was immense.
The pushback was intense. The traditionalists in the room demanded a focus on the supernatural. They wanted the prophets to be viewed almost as magical beings.
Like angels sent from heaven.
Right, angels who float above the dirt of human existence, rather than mortal men dealing with earthly sociology. But wait, I want to play devil's advocate for the traditionalists here for a second.
Okay, go for it.
If religion is just sociology and history, doesn't it lose its divine spark? Aren't they right to try to protect the mystical element?
That's exactly the tension in the room that day. But Parwez emphasizes why that traditional, purely mystical view actually undermines the entire utility of the system.
How so?
If a prophet is a supernatural angel, they cannot possibly model a socioeconomic system for human beings.
Oh, right.
An angel doesn't have to eat. An angel doesn't get tired. An angel doesn't deal with the biological drives of greed or fear or envy.
An angel doesn't have an economy. You can't have inflation in heaven.
Precisely. It had to be a human demonstrating applied rationality. The prophets walked in markets, they engaged in trade, they were subject to severe human limitations.
They faced the brutal reality of entrenched political power.
Yes. They had to demonstrate that this system of social physics actually works for humans under the crushing pressures of earthly existence.
I am just marveling at this concept. The idea that the law of requital is as undefeated as gravity. You step off a cliff, you fall. There's no escaping the physics of it.
No escape.
If a society acts with envy, conspiracy, and injustice, like Yusuf's brothers initially did when they plotted to murder him and threw him in the well, that society will eventually collapse. The math demands it.
Absolutely.
But if a society acts with rationality, foresight, and equity, like Yusuf did when he implemented that brilliant agricultural and economic strategy to manage the grain reserves during the Egyptian famine, it thrives.
And if we connect this back to you, the listener, you really have to ask yourself, when you read history, what are you actually doing?
Are you just memorizing dates?
Exactly. Are you just memorizing the names of kings to pass a trivia test? Or are you looking for the underlying physics of why a civilization failed?
Parwez is arguing that the text demands we read history to survive the future.
Yes. We must analyze the database of failures so we don't repeat the experiment. We have to figure out why the Roman bridge rusted.
But, and here is where our deep dive takes a very sharp, profoundly controversial turn.
Brace yourself.
If this text is meant to be an exact socio-political manual governed by cause and effect, if it's the literal textbook for social physics, then the integrity of its words becomes a matter of life and death.
It becomes the single most critical issue. Because a manual with typos, contradictory instructions, or missing pages isn't just an annoyance, it can lead to an engineering disaster.
Right. If you are building a nuclear reactor and the blueprint is blurry, or if paragraph 3 contradicts paragraph 5, you have a massive problem.
A meltdown, literally.
And this leads to Parwez's most detailed and fiery argument. And again, a quick reminder to you listening. We are maintaining strict neutrality here.
Yes, completely impartial.
We are presenting this purely as the author's intense, mechanical critique of traditional historical narratives surrounding the preservation of the Quran.
Right. So Parwez tackles the concept of qira'at, which translates to variant readings. In traditional Islamic scholarship, there is an accepted mainstream belief that the text can be read in a few different valid ways.
Often attributed to different ancient Arabic dialects, right?
Yes, dialects or the memories of early reciters.
But Parwez fiercely rejects this. He says absolutely not. There are no multiple valid ways to read the manual.
None.
But hold on, I have to challenge this. Linguistics are naturally fluid. Anyone who studies ancient texts knows that oral traditions carry variations.
Sure.
How can any author claim a 1,400-year-old text has absolutely zero valid dialectical variations? Isn't he applying an impossibly modern standard of standardization to an ancient culture?
Well, from a purely historical linguistic perspective, your objection is exactly what mainstream scholars argue. They view the variations as natural and accommodated by the divine.
Okay.
But Parwez isn't arguing from a perspective of natural linguistic drift. He is arguing from the perspective of systemic utility.
Meaning what?
He argues that accepting variant readings introduces fatal legislative ambiguity. If the text is the ultimate law, the law cannot be fluid.
Ah, I see.
And he provides two very specific, highly granular linguistic examples to prove how a single vowel change or a few added words can completely alter the foundational laws of a society.
Let's look at the mechanics of those examples because they show the exact stakes of his argument. The first is the difference between nikah and muta.
Yes. Nikah is the standard Islamic marriage contract. It implies a permanent commitment meant to build a foundational unit of society, the family. But Parwez points out a variant reading attributed historically to Ibn Abbas, where the words illa ajalin musamma, which means for a specified term, were added to the verse regarding marriage.
Wait, so adding those 4 words completely changes the institution.
Yes.
It justifies muta, which is temporary marriage. You get married for a week, a month, a year, and then the contract automatically dissolves.
Exactly.
Wait, walk me through the physics of that. How does a temporary marriage contract actually destabilize a society over a century?
Well, think about the socioeconomic fallout. If marriage becomes a temporary transactional rental rather than a permanent bond, the macrostructure of society changes.
Okay.
First, you have inheritance disputes. Who inherits the wealth when the father had 50 temporary contracts?
That would be a legal nightmare.
A total mess. Second, child-rearing instability. The psychological and financial burden of raising the next generation is completely fractured.
Right, because there's no stable household.
Exactly. And third, the commodification of relationships strips away the mutual support system required for a stable community. Over generations, this erodes community trust.
It creates a permanent underclass of fractured families.
Yes, and it prevents the accumulation of generational stability. The social physics change entirely based on 4 variant words.
Wow.
Therefore, Parwez argues, the manual cannot possibly contain variant readings. It must be singularly precise.
Okay, the second example he gives is even more granular. It's about a single vowel in the verse detailing wudu, or the physical ablution, the ritual washing before prayer.
Yes. The difference between reading the word as arjulakum versus arjulakum.
Okay, unpack that Arabic grammar for us. Why does one letter matter?
In Arabic grammar, the vowel change at the end of the word changes its syntactic role in the sentence.
Okay.
Reading it with an arjulakum links the word feet to the preceding verb for washing, meaning the physical law is to actively wash the feet.
Got it.
But reading it with an I arjulakum links it to an even earlier verb for wiping, meaning the law is merely to wipe the feet, perhaps over shoes or socks.
Okay, but what does this actually mean for our discussion? Like, why is the author spending so much time dissecting the history of how the book was put together, focusing on a single vowel in a washing ritual? It seems so minor compared to civilizational collapse.
Well, because it's about the principle of legislative certainty. If the book is a precise manual, ambiguity destroys its utility.
Right, you can't have blurry blueprints.
Exactly. If a law can mean wash or wipe depending on who is reading it, it's no longer a universal law. It's a multiple-choice suggestion.
A multiple-choice suggestion, I like that.
Parwez is defending the absolute singular integrity of the text. He is saying a divine entity wouldn't give humanity a blueprint for civilizational survival that is open to dialectical whims. The stakes are just too high for typos.
And he doesn't stop there. He also takes direct aim at the doctrine of naskh, or abrogation.
Ah, yes, nas.
This is the traditional theological belief that certain verses of the text were literally canceled out or overruled by later verses as the early community evolved over its 23-year founding period.
Right.
Parwez basically mocks this idea. He points out that over the centuries, traditional scholars have debated endlessly over which verses are canceled, whittling the number down from around 500 in early history to just 5 in some modern estimates.
Yeah, the math on that is wild.
He argues that a perfect timeless manual for humanity cannot contain canceled dead laws.
Yeah.
But again, let's push back.
Okay.
If we're using the software manual analogy, doesn't software need patches? Doesn't a system need to evolve and deprecate old code?
Sure, human software does. But Parwez would counter that this isn't a v1.0 software program. It's the fundamental physics engine. You don't patch gravity.
Wow, okay.
His logic is that every single verse must have a specific, active application in the mechanics of society. If you believe parts are canceled, you are ignoring critical parts of the engine.
It's like buying a car manual where half the instructions are explicitly marked as non-functional, but they left them in the book anyway to confuse the mechanic.
That's exactly it. It makes no logical sense if it's supposed to be a flawless guide.
And finally, in this deeply controversial segment, he attacks the very narrative of how the text was compiled.
Oh, this is the really contentious part.
We've all heard the traditional stories that after the prophet died, the verses were haphazardly gathered from leaves, flat stones, and the shoulder bones of animals.
Relying heavily on the memories of men who had survived recent battles.
Right. There's even a bizarre, widely debated historical anecdote found in some traditional sources that a specific verse was written on a leaf, placed under a bed, and eaten by a domestic goat during a time of mourning, and thus lost to history forever.
Yeah, the goat story. It's infamous.
Parwez violently rejects all of this. He argues that these narratives completely undermine the credibility of the text. How can you claim this is a perfectly preserved, divine manual of social physics if its preservation relied on random bones and hungry livestock?
He insists that the prophet himself must have fully compiled and finalized the written text during his lifetime.
So no post-mortem gathering.
None. For Parwez, anything less renders the text fundamentally unreliable for the heavy lifting of building a civilization. The author is demanding we view the text as a deliberate, finished, rigorously edited constitution, not a haphazard postmortem anthology pieced together from memory.
Okay, so let's assume you have this perfect manual. You understand the laws of cause and effect.
Yeah.
You've used your Baseerah. You try to implement the system. You try to point out the rust on the bridge and organize a crew to fix it. And what happens? The entrenched powers, the people who make massive profits off the rust, fight back.
Brutally.
Brutally. Which brings us to the raw, deeply human emotion captured in the text regarding the reformers.
The text says, until the messengers despaired.
Attempting to enact systemic change based on evidence in a society steeped in blind faith and corrupt power structures is agonizing. It is a grinding, soul-crushing process.
It really is, because the entrenched powers benefit enormously from the shirk, the dualism we discussed earlier.
Right, they want to keep their predatory economic practices completely separate from moral oversight.
Exactly. When a messenger, or any reformer really, arrives armed with Baseerah evidence, logic, and a demand for structural equity, the elite don't just debate them in a town square.
No, they try to crush them economically, socially, and physically.
And the text captures that breaking point perfectly. But Parwez clarifies a crucial translation point here. When it says, until the messengers despaired and thought they were denied, did the messengers actually think the divine lied to them about the consequences catching up to the corrupt? Did they lose their faith in the physics?
Did they?
No. Parwez explains two ways to understand this, and both are deeply rooted in human psychology.
Okay.
First, it could mean the opponents, the corrupt elite, thought the messengers were lying. They looked around, saw they were still rich, still powerful, still in charge of the institutions, and they mocked the reformers.
Right, like, where is this inevitable consequence you keep talking about? Your social physics is a joke. We've been corrupt for a decade and we're richer than ever.
We're still driving on the bridge. It hasn't fallen. You're crazy.
Exactly.
The second interpretation is that the messengers themselves reached the absolute breaking point of human endurance.
That makes a lot of sense.
They fought the system for so long, faced so much violence and rejection, that they were pushed to the very edge of psychological despair just before the law of requital finally activated.
I think this is so profoundly relatable for anyone trying to enact systemic change today.
Oh, without a doubt.
Whether you're fighting for climate change mitigation, battling political corruption, or trying to dismantle institutional inequality, there is this intense, bone-deep burnout. The feeling that the entrenched powers are just too big, too well-funded, and that they will always win.
What's fascinating here is how Parwez explains the concept of the delay in the law of requital.
The delay.
Yeah, it's not a failure of the law. It goes back to the accumulative effect we discussed earlier.
The slow poisoning.
Yeah.
The rusting of the bridge.
Yes. The structural damage to the corrupt society is happening continuously behind the scenes. The institutional rot is spreading, trust is failing, supply chains of equity are breaking.
But from the outside, the empire still looks strong.
Exactly. The armies are still marching. The monuments are still gleaming. The delay is just the time it takes for the rust to finally eat through the last load-bearing beam.
The sudden collapse only looks sudden to those who haven't been paying attention.
Right. To the reformer armed with Baseerah, the collapse was mathematically guaranteed the moment the society chose inequity over justice.
It's just agonizing waiting for the math to catch up to the reality.
Very much so.
Which brings us finally to the culmination of this deep dive.
Yeah.
The final thoughts of the Surah's epilogue. And it encapsulates everything we've talked about into one beautiful, mechanical, linguistic concept.
Ibrat.
Ibrat.
It is a really powerful word. Parwez defines it perfectly based on its root structure. It comes from a root meaning to cross over.
Like a bridge.
Yes, like a bridge.
We're back to the bridge, but a completely different kind this time.
We are. This is a positive bridge. An Ibra is a bridge of deduction. It is the mental leap you make when you observe evidence and arrive at a logical, unseen conclusion.
Okay. Give me an example of that.
To tailor this to our theme of social physics, think of a forensic accountant looking at a massive corporation's ledger.
Right.
They don't need to actually see the CEO physically stealing cash from the vault, right?
No, of course not.
The Ibra is seeing the structural anomalies in the spreadsheet, the hidden shell companies, the missing assets. The ledger mathematically proves the theft. The accountant uses Ibra to cross from the numbers to the reality of the crime.
So when the text tells the stories of the past, like the story of Yusuf or the ruins of past nations, it's explicitly saying these are not bedtime stories.
No.
They're not historical entertainment. They are Ibra. They're deductive bridges meant for a specific type of person.
The Ulil Albab.
The Ulil Albab.
Yes, the Ulil Albab are the people of deep intellect, the people who use empirical observation. When they look at the ruins of an ancient civilization, they don't just see broken stones and pretty pottery.
Right.
They use the Ibra to cross over and see the societal corruption, the economic hoarding, the breakdown of justice that caused the collapse.
They see the anomalies in the historical ledger. Let's slow down here for a second because Parwez introduces two more crucial concepts back to back, tasdeeq and tafsil.
Yes, these are important.
Before we get to tafsil, I want to make sure I fully grasp tasdeeq. Give me a modern, real-world example of tasdeeq in action.
Okay, so tasdeeq is often weakly translated as confirming or believing it's true. But in the realm of social physics, it means verifying through practical results.
So it's about action.
Yes, you don't prove a socio-political system works by writing a nice poem about it or by forcing people to sign a loyalty oath. You prove it by implementing it.
Right.
If a city implements a new housing policy based on equity, the tasdeeq isn't the mayor's speech. The tasdeeq is a decade later when homelessness is eradicated and the community is actually thriving. The tangible, verifiable results are the tasdeeq.
Got it. It's the proof of concept.
Exactly.
And finally, the text mentions tafsil, which translates to detail. Parwez notes that critics often mock texts like this, asking, well, if this book details everything necessary for human life, where is cure for malaria? Where is the formula for quantum mechanics?
Right. They want it to be a literal encyclopedia of all human knowledge, like a Wikipedia of the universe.
But Parwez clarifies that tafsil means it contains the distinct, unjumbled foundational principles and laws necessary for human socio-political guidance and prosperity.
Yes.
It gives you the immutable laws of how humans interact, how justice must be applied impartially, and how wealth must not be hoarded by a ruling elite. It gives you the structural foundation.
And it's up to human intellect, using Fikr and Baseerah, to build the medical science and the engineering on top of that foundation.
It's the structural blueprint for the entire civilization, not the recipe book for the cafeteria inside the civilization.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It is incredible to trace the journey of this text from its beginning to this grand finale.
It's quite a ride.
It starts with a very human, almost unbearably intimate story of a boy betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a dark well, a victim of human jealousy. And it ends with this sweeping intellectual treatise on how human reason, empirical evidence, and adherence to universal laws are the only things standing between us and the abyss of civilizational collapse.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Parwez's ultimate thesis is that knowledge is only valuable when it is practically applied.
Yeah.
The text, in this view, is essentially begging humanity to wake up. Look at the ruins of the past. Use your empirical evidence. Reject the comforting illusion of blind faith and the hypocrisy of dualism.
Build a rational, equitable society.
Because the law of requital is undefeated, and the consequences of ignoring it are mathematically fatal.
Okay, let's summarize the immense journey we just took in this deep dive.
We covered a lot today.
We really did. We started with the creeping death of societies, how compartmentalizing our morals leads to unseen structural rot. We unpacked the absolute demand for Baseerah, the empirical evidence in critical thinking that inherently threatens entrenched power.
Yes.
We explored the massive historical clash of the Mutazilites, proving how dangerous reason can be. We examined the immutable law of requital, the idea that history's ruins are a laboratory of social physics.
And the controversy, of course.
We navigated the fierce, complex debate over textual integrity, understanding why a civilizational manual cannot survive the ambiguity of variant readings or canceled laws. And finally, we arrived at Ibrat, the realization that historical narratives are meant to be bridges to reason for the intellect.
It completely reframes how one might interact with ancient wisdom. It moves it from the realm of the mystical, where we passively wait for miracles, into the realm of the pragmatic and the urgent, where we are responsible for the architecture of our own survival.
It really does. And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over, something that builds directly on Parwez's concept of social physics.
Let's hear it.
If the ruins of past civilizations, the dry aqueducts, the jungle-swallowed pyramids, are the physical, unavoidable proof of the law of requital, what ruins is our current global society actively building right now?
Oh, wow. That's a heavy question.
When the archaeologists of the future, the Ulil Albab of the next millennia, dig us up and act as forensic accountants on our ledger, what structural failures will they deduce from our remains? Are we currently sitting in the creeping shadow phase of societal collapse, walking blindly past the structural evidence of our own decay?
Are we the oblivious commuters on the rusting bridge?
Exactly. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. We respect your time, and we hope this conversation encourages you to keep questioning the world around you, to keep demanding evidence, and to never walk blindly past the signs. Keep using your Baseerah.